Now, gymnosperm or conifer reproductive biology has a lot of similarities to angiosperm reproductive biology. The sort of series of reproductive events is very similar, but there obviously are some differences as well. Keep in mind, conifers are evolutionarily older than angiosperms, so there are some key differences. And probably the key difference is that conifers do not produce true flowers and fruits. So conifer reproductive structures are not true flowers. Now, sometimes you'll hear people refer to pine flowers, but they're sort of speaking colloquially, and that's not botanically correct. So, and then, and again, conifers do not produce true fruits. Their seeds are born naked on usually a woody bract of some sort and are not surrounded by a ripened ovary or fruit as in angiosperm. So those are some of the key differences. So at any rate, for instance, in pine, these are the female reproductive structures in pine. These are the Ovulate Strobili. That's the plural. Singular is Strobilus. I've heard Steve McKeon call these strobili. They're pronounced one way or the other. Steve is likely right. He's the expert, so Ovulate Strobili. So these are Ovulate Strobili and emerging on a pine. That's the female reproductive structures. Sometimes people call these seed cones. And again, that's sort of a colloquial term for the Ovulate Strobili. Male reproductive parts on conifers or pines are staminate strobili, or Strobilus for singular, sometimes called pollen cones, colloquially. These are the male reproductive structures. Really nice photo there from the UGA database showing the pollen being shed from those cones. It's interesting to take a look at trees when they're in flower or when the strobili have emerged, and to observe the distribution on Monoecious species, the distribution of those reproductive structures when they have imperfect structures. So in conifers, for instance, you'll see that those ovulate strobili here, for instance, tend to be distributed more towards the top of the crown, and the pollen cones or staminate strobili tend to be distributed more towards the lower part of the crown. And it's interesting to think, okay, why did that evolve? What is the likely evolutionary advantage of the distribution of, for instance, cones, male and female cones, or staminate and ovulate strobili? That is likely an adaptation that reduces inbreeding in forest trees, which are typically outcrossing species where inbreeding depression occurs. So by distributing the ovulate strobili higher in the crown, or the female reproductive structures higher in the crown, that reduces the pollination, reduces pollen falling onto the female reproductive structure, and reduces inbreeding or selfing, which is problematic in most forest trees. In conifers, when you read forest biology textbook, typically they'll present two main patterns of timing of reproductive events in conifers: a 2-year cycle and a 3-year cycle. And this is one of my little rants, is that I never understood why they call those 2-year cycles and 3-year cycles. So for instance, the 2-year cycle that is typically presented that's typical of spruces, larch, Douglas fir, hemlock, for instance, basically looks just like, or the timing is very similar to angiosperm timing, where cone primordia are initiated in the fall. They overwinter in a bud. The cones or staminate and ovulate strobili emerge in the spring, are pollinated and fertilized in the spring and early summer, and then cone maturation and seed release occurs in the fall. So that is typically presented in the textbooks as a 2-year cycle. And I think they call it that because it occurs in 2 separate calendar years. This calendar year in October, November, and December, and then this calendar year the following year. But it's really only a 12-month cycle. So it's really a 12-month, a 1-year reproductive cycle. So that's my trivial rant. When I write a tree biology textbook, I'll fix that. But at any rate, that is typically presented as the 2-year reproductive cycle, which occurs over a 12-month period. So then the 3-year cycle, which is typical of most pines, is interesting in that its first few steps are similar in that cone primordia are initiated in the fall, those buds overwinter, the staminate and ovulate strobili emerge in the spring, and the pollen flies, and the pollen lands on the ovulate strobili in the spring. Pollen tube growth usually starts, but then that pollen tube growth is arrested, and that's where things diverge. So basically, pollen tube growth starts and then stops, and basically the whole process stops for almost a year. And it's not until the following spring that pollen tube growth initiates again. The pollen tube growth finishes, the sperm cells migrate down the pollen tube, fertilize the egg cells, and fertilization occurs that following spring. And then cone maturation and seed release occurs that following summer. So this process, which is called a 3-year cycle in most of the textbooks, is really basically a 24-month, a 2-year cycle. So at any rate, again, I'll fix that when I write my textbook. So what that means is in pines, that process basically occurs over a 2-year, 24-month period. So then comparing those two together again, in those 2-year cycle species and in angiosperms, that whole thing is done in 12 months, whereas put on the same scale here, pines take, a 24-month period to finish that reproductive cycle. So what that also means is that when you look at the ovulate strobili, the seed cones in pine, you might see ovulate strobili in a number of different forms. So for instance, this is the 1-month stage of Ovulate Strobilulus in a slash pine. This is the 1-year stage, so this seed cone has been pollinated, but fertilization hasn't occurred yet. So this might be in fall after emergence in the spring of the ovulate strobili. This is what that seed cone will look like in that first fall. But then in that year following that fall, this is the mature seed cone that has released its seed a full year later. after fertilization has actually occurred. So this is a nice example of some cones that I observed. This is in ponderosa pine. So this was in the late summer. So this is ponderosa pine in late summer. So we've got seed cones here, Ovulate Strobilulus in late summer. These have been pollinated but not fertilized yet. Whereas this is a second year Ovulate Strobilulus, a seed cone. This cone will open up later on in the fall and distribute seed, while this Ovulate Strobilulus will overwinter, and fertilization will occur the following summer, and it will look like this in the following year. So, reproductive patterns in pines a little more complicated and spread out over a little bit longer period of time. By the way, aren't these Ovulate Strobilulus beautiful? I think those are really a beautiful color. Serotinous cones are an interesting subcase for pine reproduction in that serotinous cones do not necessarily open in the summer fall when they've matured. Serotinous cones are held closed by resin and will typically only open when exposed to high temperatures, usually with a fire. Sometimes, hot summer temperatures can cause them to open, but in general, serotiny is thought to be an adaptation to fire. So, for instance, lodgepole pine, Pinus contorta, is a species that has serotinous cones. And there are other species. So what pine species in Florida has serotinous cones? There's a variety of sand pine that has serotinous cones as well. And again, the serotiny is thought to be an adaptation to fire. So sand pine and lodgepole pine have similar life history traits where serotiny comes into play. So here's the example with lodgepole pine. Took some of these pictures on a trip out west to my family, driving into Crater Lake National Park, and pulled the Suburban into the ditch to go take pictures of lodgepole pine. And of course, my family always says, "What are you doing?" Well, I gave them a lecture on serotiny. So here's lodgepole pine, a dense forest of lodgepole pine here on one side of the road near Crater Lake National Park. And on the other side of the road, the same stand of lodgepole pine, but had been burned in a stand replacing wildfire. So same forest across the street. Clearly they stopped the fire at the road. This is what it looked like across the street. So you can tell a crown fire raged through there, killed all the overstory trees. When that happened, all the serotinous cones opened, and the forest floor is covered in lodgepole pine seedlings that emerged when those cones opened. Seed was distributed on what was now a mineral seed bed. And what that does is produce, a blanket of lodgepole pine reproduction. So this is the natural life history cycle for lodgepole pine. And we see the same thing in sand pine. If you go to the Ocala National Forest, you'll see these stands of sand pine. Once they get up to 30, 40 years of age, they're starting to be hit by root diseases, and they're starting to lean over into each other. They'll be hit by a lightning strike. Crown fire will rage through those and be a stand replacing fire, and then you'll get a blanket of reproduction afterwards, after that stand replacing fire? Well, in the Ocala National Forest, in those sand pine stands, they are home to scrub jays, which are an endangered bird that's dependent on those young life stages of sand pine. And so they're dependent on that stand replacing fire cycle. Sometimes we can't depend on those stand replacing fires, so the U.S. Forest Service does clear cuts of those sand pine stands and will leave the slash, and those serotinous cones will typically open in the Florida heat after those clear cuts and produce, again, those young stands of sand pine, and the scrub jays will move in. So that's the story of serotinous cones in some species that are associated with these life history traits. To me, it's a really neat example that we can, when we observe life history traits, we can see those life history traits often recurring in different species. So for instance, in lodgepole pine out west, or in sand pine here in the southeastern United States, we see similar life history traits.